Hi, this is Bill Gaswich, and this is Blazor Project Structure Part 2. Today the agenda will be, we're going to create the API, then we're going to create the client service, and then finally we're going to link the Blazor component to the client service. All the code can be found at my GitHub page below and in the notes, and it'll be the branch architecture Part 2. So let's get started. Okay, here we are in Visual Studio. We want to add in the API and the client-based service that calls it. So let's add the API first. APIs in .NET Core are implemented through controllers. So we'll go ahead and we'll add in a folder for the controllers, because I always like to keep things separate. And that is the default, by the way, in the controller folder. And then in there, we're going to add in a new item. And we'll add in a controller. The other one generates a little bit of code for you. It takes a little bit of time, so I like to do it this way. And we'll call this the person controller. All right. So you don't have to watch me type. I'll copy in what we need. Okay, I've copied in the code. We have a couple of unresolved references. We will take care of those. iPerson reference, we just need to reference the server BL services. And in person DTO, we just need to reference the DTO project, which we did that way, and everything gets resolved. So what are we doing here? A couple of things. First, this controller produces application JSON. So JSON will be sent back to as part of the request. And we inject the iPerson service here. So we follow this pattern to do that. And then we define two API calls. First, the get API persons. And we do that through this attribute here. It returns a list of a person DTO, and then it uses the service, person service.getPersons. And same thing down here, except we pass it an ID, and we return a person DTO only, not a list. It passes the ID, uses the service as well to pass it back. So instead of the Blazor component calling the service, now we're going to be using this API to also call the service. So that is the controller. Now, when we do that, we need to add a couple of things into the startup in order to enable routing for the startup. So in order to do that, up here we do services.add controller. There we go. Now we don't have any views, so we don't need the controllers with views, so we do it that way. And then in the endpoints, what we do is we add endpoints.map default controller route. And what that does is it looks at those attributes that are within the controller, and it'll allow for routing to those. So now we should have an API. If we run this, and if in the browser we type in /API/persons, there we go. We've got the information coming back. If I say, all right, /API/person/3, I get Barney Rubble. So the API is working. Now, the next thing we need to do is call the API from within the client service. So we have to create a client service. So let's go ahead and right-click and add a new project. So we right-clicked on the solution and we're adding a new project. We'll add another class library, and we'll call this one Blazor app from scratch service.client.bl. Okay. Now that we've done that, we can get rid of this class 1. We don't need that. All right. And then what we want to do is we want to create a couple of services. So let's go ahead and first create the folder for the services. We're going to call this, we'll add a class to that. We'll call this iPerson client service. Oops, I added an extra S there. Let me correct that before we get too far down the path. Yes. We will add a new item, another class. We'll call this person client service. All right, so let's go into the interface. And here we are going to say public. And since we're going to make an API call, we're actually going to return a task of type list person DTO. And we will call this get persons. Okay. And we will have a task person DTO. And we'll call this get person, and we'll pass in an int ID. Okay, so let's get this, and we'll make this an interface. And we need to resolve some of these references, so we'll go ahead and resolve this. And we will also resolve that. We've done this many times before. So notice we can't resolve this with the quick help, and that's because we need to resolve a reference. We need this to reference the DTO. We do that. And now we should be able to resolve the reference perfectly. Okay, so here we have the two services that we're going to use, or the two methods within the service that we're going to use. Now let's go ahead and implement those. Here we will use iPerson client service. Yeah, for some reason that S stayed around, so we'll just get rid of that here. And there we go. That resolves. And let's do and implement the interface. And here, now we're going to make an API call here. So in order to make an API call, you'd need to use HTTP client. And rather than duplicate that here or create, I like to use a helper service. And the helper service I like to create is, I'll call it HTTP helper. And we'll create a new class. I'll call this HTTP helper. Helper. There we go. And rather than you watch me type, I'll go ahead and copy in the code. Okay, so we created a static class HTTP helper. We define HTTP client, and that's unresolved right now, so we'll go ahead and resolve that. It's a client of type HTTP client. And then we will use that client here in this HTTP get, and this is just executing a get. So what gets passed in, so first it's a task because it's an async call. It's a task. So HTTP get gets a type that it's going to return, and it will get a part of a URI string. So here we define what the request is, what the URI string is, and we'll pass that in here. and then this 44301 happens to be the local host that I'm on. Now obviously we would want to drive this through some type of configuration or environment file, but for now we'll just do it this way. And the way you can get that 44301 is if you go up to the server, go into properties, and do launch settings, you'll see the SSL port is 44301. Okay, so that's how you get that. We're going to be accepting JSON, as you saw when we did the server or the API. We're producing JSON, and this actually calls the client and sends it asynchronously the request. We get the response back. If it's successful status code, we get the JSON out of the response, and then we convert it, and we need to resolve this. And if you notice down here, I still use Newtonsoft. So here we'll install the latest. That resolves. This will deserialize it into the class of type T, which will either be a list of person DTO or DTO. We'll show you how to do that. And then we return it. And if for some reason it's not successful, we'll throw an exception. So that's the helper class that we'll use. So let's go back to the implementation. So now let's implement the person client service. Now, first thing we want to do is we will do the get person, and for that it's return await HTTP helper .http get, and in this case we're going to get a person DTO back. And what we will do is we will pass this in a, let's do it this way, $person/ and then the ID. Okay. Now because we added the await, we need to make this an async. And that takes care of that one. And then what we will do here is something very similar. For get persons, we'll return await HTTP helper .http get person. Whoops. This one we want a list of person DTO back. And for this we will call persons. And there we go. Just need to add an await here. I mean an async. Here we go. And there is the client service. Okay, so the one other thing we need to do once we've done that is we need to go into the startup, and since this is still server based, we need to add a and we're injecting it, we need to add a services. Add scoped and person client service, comma, person client service. Now that's not resolving. If we right click, quick action, it's still not resolving because we need to add a reference to that. And we need to do that now because we still are using Blazor server. We won't need that in the future. All right, so we added that. Now if I right click, it resolves fine. And person client service isn't resolving, and it's not resolving because we forgot to make it public. So once we do that, we go back to startup, and it has resolved. Okay, so now the final thing that we have to do is we have to change the Razor component in the person component. Obviously this doesn't change, but the person Razor component needs to change in order to use not iPerson service, but iPerson client service. Now that needs to be referenced. And once we do that, sometimes the using doesn't take the first time, and there you go. Okay. We need to now add in, because this is an asynchronous call, we need to add in async task, and there is a async version of this, and we will make this await, and we will make this await, and that resolves that. Same thing needs to be done here. Async task and my person await, and everything resolves. Okay, so let's run it and see what we get. We go to the person object. It still paints. We've got the list of people: Barney Rubble, Betty Rubble. Now, how do we know whether we're using the API or not? Well, let's go set a breakpoint. So back here, I will go into controllers, person controller, and let's just set this here in the get person ID. Okay, so we will go ahead and run it again. Click. Oh, we hit it, and the ID is 1, because that's in the person Razor. The first thing we do here is get person with 1. Okay, let's continue. And when I go and choose Betty Rubble, we get hit it again, and we're 4. So we're actually calling the API now. Okay, and that is part 2. Now in the next video, we'll actually move everything into a WebAssembly, and you'll have the WebAssembly calling the API. Thanks for watching, and as always, please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions or comments. And as always, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.